My paper proposal for War Stories is PTSD and the statistics that were overlooked going back as far as World War I, and looking over a couple of classic novels on war stories and looking for underlying tones of PTSD, along with studying some of the authors that we have studied so far at this semester and looking for PTSD signs in the poetry. I'm going to talk a little about statistics and PTSD. No one knew of PTSD before World War I. World War I came around and they said that PTSD was a symptom of shell shock from getting the shells bouncing off of the soldiers' helmets. They shook it off after a couple of days and sent them back out to the front lines, and they started seeing that other soldiers were displaying these symptoms who haven't been in combat. So it was frowned upon to have PTSD, so no one really came forward with the PTSD. They just kind of hid it. Some symptoms of PTSD are loss of memory, insomnia, terrifying dreams, pain, emotional instability, lack of self-confidence and self-control, attacking of unconscious or of changed consciousness, sometimes accompanied by convulsive movements, resembling those characteristics of epileptic fits, incapacity to understand any but the simplest matters, obsessive thoughts, usually of the gloomiest and most painful kind, which is a lot of what we see in the poetry that we've been reading. Hallucinations, delusions, which make for hell on earth for these soldiers. Just to go over some statistics real quick. World War I, it was said that 1 in every 20 soldiers had PTSD. In 2004, they said 25,000 World War II vets were still being treated for PTSD symptoms. I'm sorry, that was World War II, had 1 in every 20 soldiers that had PTSD. Moving on to the Korean War, 30% of the soldiers had PTSD and are still alive today. Vietnam had 15.2% of all male veterans. That's 479,000 who had served who have PTSD, and 8.1% of the women. And this was concluded between 1986 and 1988. Persian Gulf War, said to be these soldiers saw the lowest number because they saw the least amount of action. They had around, out of the 697,000, 7% of the men and 16% of the women claimed PTSD 18 to 24 months after war. War in Afghanistan, 18% of the soldiers. Moving on to the war in Iraq, 20%. So it's going up for every war that we have. People are coming forward with the signs and symptoms of PTSD. Go over a couple of the poems, reading those, looking for different lines that describe the dark thoughts that were described in part of the symptoms. And then I'm going to move on to 2 of the novels. I'm going to study Enemies by Isaac Singer and The Things They Changed, The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. Both novels have underlying PTSD tones. The Things They Carried, I'll just read you a little bit of what I've studied so far. The reality of returning home was really hard for the soldier in the story. It says there was war over there and there was no place in particular to go at home. These soldiers returned home and couldn't help but dwell on the past and their unfulfilled dreams. Thoughts of sorrows and loss overwhelm the veterans as they return home. Crushed from the horror of war, they come back to even bigger disappointments and sadness. Instead of mellow lives they led before they went to war, they came back to the emptiness of cold beds and cold family ambiance and overall loss. So both of these novels have the same theme, PTSD. So I'm going to go over those as well and compare those to the poetry we read.